The world that would one day be called Mars began in silence, deep within the whirling birth clouds of a young star. Dust and gas circled the newborn sun, dancing to the pull of gravity, gathering into clumps that grew with patient collisions. Amid this cosmic ballet, a reddish spark began to take shape, iron-rich dust fusing and swirling until it became a small, sturdy sphere. It did not know it would one day be a world of dust storms and frozen plains, only that it was becoming something more than drifting matter. In that quiet, it waited. As time flowed, the red planet cooled, its molten heart still glowing beneath a crust that began to harden. Volcanoes erupted across its face, painting the skies with ash and molten rock. Rivers of lava carved valleys that would later be traced by winds and frost. Each eruption was a heartbeat, a reminder that though far smaller than its blue sibling to come, Mars too was alive in its own way. The young planet trembled and breathed fire, then rested again in the growing chill of space. In the early dawns that followed, its skies shimmered in faint golds and rusty pinks. The light of the sun, weaker here, stretched gently across wide plains of basalt and stone. Crystals formed beneath the surface, locked within layers of minerals. Each glint of iron in those rocks told a story of ancient heat, of pressure, and of cooling patience. It was a place where time slowed, where even change took on a measured, almost meditative rhythm. Mars was learning how to endure. As its surface settled, water began to flow not as rain, but as mist condensing into streams that cut narrow paths through valleys. For a fleeting era, lakes gathered in low basins, shimmering beneath thin skies. Mars reflected its small share of sunlight with quiet pride, wearing its frozen rivers like ribbons of memory. It was a fragile balance, a world on the edge of warmth, and for millions of years, it teetered between ice and vapor, holding the dream of oceans in its soil. The planet's magnetic field, once strong, began to fade. Deep within, its core cooled, slowing the spinning dance of molten metals. Without that invisible shield, the solar wind swept in, a silent storm stripping the air, scattering atoms into the dark. The atmosphere thinned, the warmth bled away, and the whisper of breezes turned cold. Mars began to lose its voice, its once blue lakes turning to frost, its skies dimming into pale, thin veils of dust. And yet, even in this retreat, there was beauty. The red surface, oxidized and ancient, became a canvas for sunlight. At dawn, the horizon glowed softly, painting the land in hues of rose and amber. Shadows stretched for miles over plains of iron dust, and the air, though nearly gone, carried fine particles that shimmered faintly in the fading light. Mars was becoming a world of quiet endurance, not dead, but waiting, listening to the slow rhythm of time itself. Dust storms began to wander across the planet's face, great veils of ochre sweeping over mountains and canyons. They were the breath of the world, reshaping dunes, polishing stones, and writing new stories on the surface. From afar, these storms looked like moving shadows, gentle yet vast. They were the lullabies of a restless world, carrying whispers of the past across the silence of its plains. In the heart of the planet's long sleep, Olympus Mons rose, the tallest volcano in the solar system, a monument to fire's memory. Its slopes stretched higher than any mountain on Earth, but no voices echoed from its peak, no footsteps marked its surface. Around it, the Tharsis Plateau held frozen evidence of the world's fiery youth. Mars, now colder and quieter, still kept the scars and triumphs of its creation written upon its red skin. Valles Marineris, a canyon deeper than imagination, carved itself across the face of Mars. It was a wound, yet also a wonder, stretching thousands of kilometers, echoing the planet's history of upheaval and collapse. If you stood at its rim, even with no air to breathe, you would see layers of time folded into stone. The cliffs, tinted in copper and gold, would tell stories of rivers, dust, and wind that never truly ceased. Mars was not lifeless, it was a book written in silence. The sun, distant and small from this world, moved slowly across the sky, casting long blue shadows at twilight. Each evening, as light faded, the temperature dropped sharply, and frost crept across the rocks. It sparkled faintly in the thin air, a dusting of silver across the red earth. The planet slept beneath its icy blanket, dreaming of the warmth it once knew. In that stillness, it held its secrets close, as if guarding the memory of its brief, watery youth. Meteorites came, small and large, carving new marks into its ancient face. Some carried fragments of other worlds, some brought the seeds of chemistry, the carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen that make up life. Each impact stirred the soil, mixing and reshaping, leaving tiny reminders that creation never truly stopped. Even in stillness, Mars was participating in the slow art of becoming. The cosmos was not done with it yet. Time passed in spans so vast they became almost abstract. Seasons shifted, thin winds moved the dust, and the polar caps grew and shrank in quiet rhythm. White layers of frozen carbon dioxide gleamed beneath the sun, melting slightly before refreezing in the long winters. The planet's heartbeat slowed, but it did not vanish. Every whisper of wind, every faint glint of frost, was another breath in the long slumber of Mars. In this quiet age, light became poetry. Sunsets lingered longer here, their colors drawn out by the dust apricot, violet, and deep scarlet. The sky, thin but clear, glowed with otherworldly calm. It was as if Mars was still speaking, softly, through color and shadow, through the play of light across dunes and craters. The planet had found a new language, silence painted with radiance. The red world continued its journey around the sun, patient and faithful. It carried its frozen memories with it, each orbit a meditation in solitude. Other worlds circled nearby, but Mars remained apart, not barren, simply still. Its quiet rotation, its thin breath of air, became a rhythm of waiting. It was not forgotten, it was merely preparing for what might come next. Perhaps, somewhere beneath its surface, warmth still pulsed, small chambers of melted ice, gases shifting in the dark. In those places, the chemistry of possibility stirred faintly, like dreams that never fade completely. The planet's crust, cracked and ancient, hid these small whispers of potential life, holding them gently against the cold. Mars was not empty, it was keeping watch. Eons later, the faint glow of blue from a nearby world became brighter. Earth, the younger sibling, had flourished, its oceans alive with sound and motion. Mars, from its quiet vantage, watched this with no envy, only patience. It was not its time yet. The red planet waited as if knowing that one day, life might seek it out again, bringing warmth back to its frozen plains. The winds continued to sweep softly over dunes of iron dust. They sculpted ripples that glowed in the sunset, moving slowly over centuries. In their wake, they revealed small stones polished by time, fragments of a world that had once burned bright. Every grain of dust carried a history of volcanoes, rivers, and winds, each one a fragment of a story that spanned billions of years. Night on Mars was a cathedral of stars. The thin air made the heavens sharp and endless, each point of light steady and clear. Phobos and Deimos drifted overhead, small and swift, casting faint shadows across the plains. The cold deepened, but the silence was soothing, like the hush of a long exhale. The planet, bathed in cosmic quiet, seemed content in its waiting. And so, the prelude of red light continued, an overture to a story not yet complete. The world was ready, not in haste but in patience, to receive what might one day come from beyond its skies. It waited for explorers, for eyes that would once again see its beauty, for hearts that would feel its calm. Mars was a lesson in endurance, a hymn to stillness and time. Even now, across the distance of space, that red glow endures. It shines like an ember in the darkness, neither burning nor fading, simply being. The prelude remains, soft and eternal, a planet waiting beneath the thin breath of dust, wrapped in the light of a distant sun, dreaming quietly of what it once was, and what it might still become. There was a time, far back in the quiet corridors of ancient ages, when Mars breathed a gentler air. The sunlight, though still weaker than Earth's, was soft and nurturing, spreading warmth across wide plains and frozen ridges. The red dust did not yet dominate everything. Instead, stones glistened with dew, and the faint whisper of wind carried moisture through the air. The planet was young and alive, its heart still warm, and its surface trembled with the slow rhythm of new beginnings. Clouds drifted lazily through the thin atmosphere, silver and copper against a faint orange sky. They gathered moisture from the evaporating seas, forming delicate veils that glowed at dawn. Rain sometimes fell, not in torrents, but in gentle curtains that traced the slopes of mountains and craters. Each droplet carried whispers of warmth, coaxing minerals to mingle, carving tiny valleys that would one day become memories of rivers. It was a time when Mars hummed softly with the music of water. The sunlight danced upon shallow lakes that mirrored the pale heavens. Beneath their surfaces, currents stirred fine grains of sediment, weaving patterns that glimmered like silk. Along the shores, ice melted and refroze in slow rhythms, leaving behind rippled traces of ancient tides. It was a fragile beauty, a world balancing between warmth and cold, holding tightly to its moment of comfort in the vast, indifferent dark of space. Volcanoes still breathed then, but their fire was no longer fierce. Instead, their warmth brought life to the soil. Gases vented into the sky, thickening the atmosphere just enough to cradle heat. The air carried traces of carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor, the ingredients of a gentle greenhouse. The planet's heartbeat, once wild and molten, had steadied into a calm pulse. The surface grew softer, shaped not just by fire but by flowing water and time. Rivers began to carve their paths through valleys that stretched like silver threads across the land. They wound through craters, pooled into basins, and formed quiet deltas. From orbit, had there been eyes to see, the planet might have looked veined with blue, a young world learning how to flow. These rivers spoke a language of persistence, tracing stories into the rock that would last for eons, even after the water itself was gone. The air, though thin by Earth's measure, carried a warmth that touched the soil. Winds swept softly over plains of basalt and sand, lifting moisture from the surface and carrying it across continents. Frost formed at night but melted each morning beneath a kinder sun. Mars had found a temporary balance, a fragile, golden moment where warmth lingered just long enough for change to unfold. It was as if the planet itself sighed in relief. The great volcano Olympus Mons glowed faintly with heat from within, its vast slopes still warm under the crust. Around it, steam rose from fissures where groundwater met the planet's lingering fire. These oases of warmth created pockets where minerals reacted and new compounds formed. Deep underground, chemical dances may have begun, simple, hesitant, yet rich with possibility. In those hidden places, the seeds of life may have stirred. The sky, tinted but not yet as dusty as it would become, often blushed at sunrise. The horizon shimmered with pale orange light, casting long reflections over the water. When the thin rains came, they left behind trails of darkened soil that shone for a brief, tender moment before drying again. The air carried a scent, metallic, earthy, and faintly sweet, like the breath of a cooling forge mixed with rain. Mars was alive in its own quiet language. Across the southern highlands, small lakes nestled in craters, protected by their rims from harsh winds. They collected meltwater from seasonal snows and kept it safe in shimmering silence. Beneath their frozen tops, liquid water might have persisted, warmed by geothermal heat. These craters became sanctuaries of calm, reflections of a sky that was learning to hold warmth longer with each passing season. On the plains, sedimentary layers began to build. Dust mixed with silt, compressed by the weight of time into fine, solid rock. Within these layers, the memory of water became fossilized ripples and ridges marking the rhythm of gentle waves. Mars was writing its story in stone, engraving evidence of its warmth so that, long after the water faded, the tale would still be there to read. The planet was a patient scribe of its own history. Even the poles, though crowned with frost, softened in this age. Sheets of ice advanced and retreated with the turning of the planet's slow seasons. Beneath them, meltwater occasionally formed, seeping through cracks and feeding distant valleys. The ice breathed with the years, inhaling during the long winters, exhaling during the brief summers. It was as if the entire planet pulsed with a shared, steady rhythm of life and rest. For a time, Mars and the Sun shared a tender understanding. The distance between them did not mean indifference. The Sun's light, though faint, was constant and loyal. It reached through the cold of space to kiss the red surface with enough warmth to awaken it. The planet turned slowly beneath this kindness, letting its surface drink in every drop of light it could. This relationship, gentle but fleeting, gave birth to the world's most vibrant days. Deep beneath the crust, warmth from the fading core still moved through layers of rock. It met buried ice and created networks of hydrothermal vents, releasing bubbles of steam and gas. These hidden places were like lungs breathing beneath the planet's skin. Here, chemistry found its stage, minerals exchanged, molecules collided, and patterns formed that hinted at life's earliest architecture. Mars was quietly experimenting with existence. From the heavens, the young sun's light filtered through a soft haze, scattering pink and gold. The evenings stretched endlessly, with the air cooling slowly into peace. Dust had not yet thickened the atmosphere, so the stars shone sharply at night. Phobos and Deimos rose and set, their paths carving delicate arcs above the sleeping plains. The warmth of day gave way to a chill that was tolerable, a balance of fire and frost. The planet's heart still beat faintly, driving small tremors through the crust. These gentle quakes released energy, stirring underground chambers of water and rock. Every pulse reminded the planet of its origin, of fire, collision, and creation. Yet now that energy was tempered, softened into a nurturing warmth. Mars was learning calm, just as a once restless child learns the comfort of stillness. And though no eyes had yet looked upon its beauty, Mars glowed in quiet pride. The reflection of sunlight off its lakes and rivers would have shimmered through the thin sky, turning it into a soft mirror for the cosmos. The red soil deepened in hue, touched by oxidation and time, glowing softly beneath the tender warmth of its youth. It was a planet that had found its own peace for a little while. But every warmth has its waning. Slowly, imperceptibly, the planet began to lose its gentle breath. The core cooled more with each millennium, the magnetic shield faded further, and the solar wind began its silent theft. Molecule by molecule, the atmosphere thinned. The rivers ran shorter, the lakes shallower. What once had been a world of glimmers and rains began to drift toward stillness again. Even as this fading began, Mars held on to its beauty. The last lakes sparkled beneath thin sunlight, their surfaces trembling with frost and memory. The wind, cooler now, brushed softly through valleys that once echoed with running water. The planet did not resist, it simply accepted, settling once again into a slower rhythm. Its warmth, though fading, lingered like an afterglow of peace. The rocks that once lay beneath rivers now hardened into memory, preserving the ripples and channels of what had been. Silica and clay held traces of once liquid water, chemical fingerprints of a time when the planet had known gentleness. Mars became its own time capsule, a keeper of lost warmth. Every ridge, every basin, whispered the same thing: we were once alive with motion. And so the first warmth ended as softly as it began. No cataclysm, no final fire, only a long exhale into cold. The planet dimmed, yet it did not despair. In its silence, it carried the echoes of that mild age, the memory of its gentle breath. It would sleep now, beneath the dust and thin sky, waiting for another dawn, perhaps not of its own making, but of those who would one day come to remember it. The warmth that once graced Mars began to gather itself into movement. Water, freed from melting ice and geothermal breath, began its slow descent through valleys and plains. It was not rushed, it was patient, deliberate. It touched every stone as if remembering where it had once slept, whispering its history as it flowed. Each drop became a storyteller, shaping the face of a world that would one day seem still but had once known rhythm and pulse. The rivers became Mars's hands, sculpting its red body with liquid grace. In the dawns of that time, the sky carried a thin mist that drifted over the land like a memory searching for form. It gathered along the slopes of craters, condensed into beads of dew, and fell to the surface in shimmering streaks. The sunlight, faint yet persistent, turned these veils into golden silk, gliding across the plains. Beneath that gentle light, the rivers stretched out, tracing paths that would one day harden into stone, the eternal fingerprints of water. They began as trickles, winding through ancient channels cut by lava flows long cooled. Over eons, they deepened those scars, smoothing them into valleys that curved like thoughts. Sediment carried by the flow settled in layers, marking the passage of time. Every season brought new color to the soil, shades of ochre, rust, and soft gray mingling into a living palette. The rivers carved beauty not through violence, but through devotion. They understood the patience of creation. Some rivers merged into lakes that gleamed under thin skies. These lakes, shallow but persistent, became mirrors for the clouds, reflecting soft ribbons of light. Along their edges, ripples froze at night and thawed by day, creating delicate patterns, lacework in stone. Minerals gathered at the edges, forming pale rings that would remain long after the water was gone. Each lake became a diary entry, written in salts and sediments, telling of warmth that once lingered too briefly. In places where the ground dipped lower, deltas began to form wide, fan-shaped spreads of silt. Here, the water slowed and sighed, releasing the load it had carried across distances. It was in these deltas that Mars's most intricate art took shape, gentle curves and layered fans that glowed under sunlight like open hands. The planet seemed to cradle its own stories, holding them out to the future, hoping they would one day be read again. The Great Valley networks grew, winding labyrinths of channels stretching for thousands of kilometers. Some crossed craters, others vanished into plains. They were the arteries of a living world, pulsing once with motion, now preserved in silence. To stand at their edge would have been to stand at the threshold of memory itself, to see how the planet once dreamed of rivers and carried those dreams across its red heart. Far to the north, an immense basin collected water from these streams. It may have been an ocean once, wide, cold, and shallow, rippling beneath a dusty pink sky. Waves might have lapped against basalt shores, scattering foam that quickly froze in the chill air. The ocean's tides, faint though they were, smoothed the coastline, sculpting bays and capes that would one day be seen only from orbit, like faded brushstrokes on an ancient canvas. The sound of flowing water, though no one was there to hear it, must have been soft and low, the hum of life in a world of solitude. It echoed between canyon walls, carrying the promise of persistence. Each droplet that fell against rock sang a note of belonging, of purpose. Together, those sounds composed a hymn of continuity, a melody Mars still remembers, even in its silence today. When floods came, they were slow-moving giants, spreading across the plains in vast sheets. They carried stones, silt, and fragments of the planet's youth, rearranging the landscape with a sculptor's care. The floods built new channels, carved fresh valleys, and created labyrinths of erosion that glowed in the light. Even as they receded, their shapes remained, frozen echoes of their brief power. Sometimes the rivers disappeared underground, vanishing into porous rock. They traveled unseen, carving secret tunnels and chambers beneath the crust. Here, in the hidden warmth, chemical whispers continued, water reacting with minerals, forming clays rich with traces of life's raw ingredients. These subterranean flows may have persisted long after the surface froze, keeping the planet's quiet heart alive. At the equator, the rivers carved winding paths through volcanic plains. They left behind channels now dry and cracked, but their forms spoke of patience, of countless years of gentle erosion. Pebbles along their ancient beds smoothed into rounded gems of stone, proof that time and water once held conversations here. If you touched them now, you could almost feel the memory of that movement pulsing within. Dust began to return as the air thinned. The rivers, once broad and sure, shrank into narrow streams, then into rivulets, and finally into whispers. They left behind braided networks of dry channels, ghost rivers glinting under the pale light. The warmth faded, and frost crept down from the poles, reclaiming what it had lost. Yet even in retreat, water continued to sculpt, marking Mars with the grace of its farewell. Each winter grew colder. The lakes froze and did not fully thaw. The rivers paused longer each year, until they no longer moved at all. Yet the ground beneath them remembered, salts crystallized in the soil, ice trapped beneath the surface, waiting like sleeping veins of memory. Mars was entering its long rest, but it did not forget what it had once been. The map of its rivers became its face. When the atmosphere thinned enough for the wind to grow sharp, it carried fine grains of dust into the empty channels. Over centuries, those grains settled, burying the riverbeds in soft red blankets. But the patterns of flow still lay beneath, preserved in perfect silence. The planet, though cold, continued to hold warmth in its form, the warmth of memory, the glow of what once was fluid and alive. In Valles Marineris, immense canyons stretched open, shaped by ancient floods and tectonic sighs. The walls bore streaks of mineral color, reds, yellows, and faint greens, painted there by running water long gone. The canyon floor, once rippled by waves, now lay still beneath layers of dust. To look upon it would be to see time made visible, each layer a page of history left open to the stars. The sun, smaller now in the sky, cast slanted rays across these canyons at dusk. The light revealed every curve and line, every channel and tributary carved by vanished waters. Mars seemed to blush under the touch of that light, as though shyly remembering the rivers that had caressed it. Even as the air grew colder, the memory of warmth remained etched into the planet's skin. Far below, where sunlight never reached, ice clung to shadows and cracks. It preserved the fingerprints of water, tiny channels, mineral veins, and the faint smell of ancient chemistry. These frozen remnants were not dead, they were echoes waiting for breath. One day, perhaps, warmth would return, and they would melt once more, completing the story that had paused too soon. The great deltas turned to stone, but their forms remained unchanged. From orbit, they still resemble the fans of rivers that once spread joyfully into open basins. The sediment trapped within them carries records of the planet's gentler age, the ratio of elements, the texture of clay, the quiet promise of life that might have almost been. They are the fossils of motion, the art of ancient flow. With the passing of ages, Mars became still again. Yet the shapes of its rivers endured, carved so deeply that even time could not erase them. The planet itself became a monument to water's patience, to the power of softness over stone. Every ridge and gully whispered of its maker, not fire, but liquid grace. The memory of rivers became the soul of the red planet. When humans would one day arrive and walk its surface, they would trace those channels with careful steps. They would look upon the curves of deltas and valleys and see the fingerprint of a planet that once moved with liquid thought. The scientists would name the channels, but Mars already had each one named by the wind and the memory of rain. It was a dialogue across epochs. Even now, under the silence of dust storms, those ancient paths still shimmer faintly under certain lights. The wind reveals them, then hides them again, as if protecting a sacred story. The rivers no longer flow, but their memory does, through stone, through frost, through every gust that crosses their beds. Mars carries its history not in words, but in the shapes it refused to lose. And so, the chapter of water closed, leaving the planet marked forever by tenderness. The rivers, now turned to echoes, remain as veins of remembrance running through a world asleep. Mars no longer weeps nor flows, yet beneath its crimson skin, it still dreams of the days when warmth moved through it freely. The rivers traced their memory, and the memory became the planet's heart. There came a time when Mars, having been gently carved by rivers and softened by rain, gathered its waters into wide, tranquil basins. These were the shallow seas, mirrors of a fading warmth, lying still under the thin blush of its sky. They were not deep like Earth's oceans, but calm and deliberate, stretching across northern plains like sheets of bronze beneath the pale sunlight. Their surfaces shimmered faintly, moving only when a quiet wind passed, leaving soft ripples that caught the light like sighs. The air above these seas was thin, yet kind. Mists would rise from the surface at dawn, weaving ghostly veils that lingered before melting into the light. The sun, smaller and gentler from this distance, painted golden threads across the water, turning it into liquid metal. Each dawn felt eternal, each dusk a slow surrender. The basins seemed to breathe, exhaling vapor into the sky and inhaling silence in return, a delicate rhythm that spoke of balance. Sediment carried by ancient rivers flowed into these basins, layering the floors with fine silt. Minerals settled like drifting dust, building quiet archives of color, rust, ivory, and pale gray. These sediments became time itself, one layer atop another, recording each moment of the planet's soft decline. The seas were not in a hurry to vanish. They accepted their fragility with grace, holding their warmth a little longer with every sunrise. Along the shallow shores, small waves caressed the land. They touched volcanic rocks still warm from the planet's internal breath and smoothed their edges with patient persistence. Sometimes they froze at night, locking mid-motion under thin layers of ice that cracked softly at dawn. In those fractures, sunlight glittered like jewels. The planet's surface had become a painting, still, reflective, and filled with muted golds and reds. In the low basins, faint currents stirred, slow and graceful as dreams. They carried dissolved minerals, allowing chemistry to dance in subtle harmony. Beneath these calm waters, reactions took place: iron meeting oxygen, carbon meeting hydrogen, molecules embracing briefly before drifting apart again. Each meeting was a whisper, a suggestion that even in this fading warmth, the spirit of creation still lingered, waiting quietly beneath the calm. Occasionally, storms from the higher latitudes swept across the plains, disturbing the still waters. The waves rose, not in anger but in awakening, brushing against the shores before settling again into rest. Each storm left a new mark: a shifted sandbar, a ring of salt, a memory etched into the basin floor. Mars was not harsh then, it was introspective, shaping itself softly through motion and pause, like a being learning how to breathe in rhythm with the cosmos. The largest of these seas stretched across what would one day be called the Northern Plains. It reached far into the horizon, where the curve of the planet blurred into thin mist. If one could have stood upon its quiet shore, the sound would have been faint but full: the gentle lap of waves against stone, the distant hum of wind over the dunes. It was a sound made for no ears, yet it filled the world with meaning. As the years passed, evaporation began to thin the waters. The air, growing cooler, could no longer hold as much moisture. Clouds gathered less often, rains became rare. The seas receded slowly, exposing the flaws that had once hidden beneath their calm surfaces. What remained were gleaming salt flats, white mirrors that reflected the red sky. They held onto the light even after the warmth was gone, glowing like ghostly seas of crystal. Yet beneath those crystalline surfaces, water still hid. Pockets of liquid remained trapped between layers of clay and stone, preserving the memory of motion. The basins were no longer breathing through waves, but through quiet, underground whispers. In those hidden spaces, minerals continued to form delicate structures that recorded the final rhythm of the seas. Mars was teaching stillness, showing how even loss could create beauty. Volcanic heat sometimes returned, breathing life into the depths. In certain basins, steam rose where ice met warmth, creating brief, shimmering fogs that hung low over the plains. These moments felt like sighs, the planet remembering its youth for a heartbeat. The fog would drift and then dissolve, leaving behind faint stains of moisture and tiny mineral blooms. The world had learned to cherish small acts of renewal. At dusk, the seas glowed with a color unlike any other, a soft rose blending into pale copper. The fading sun scattered light through thin air, bending it into delicate gradients that spread over the water's face. The planet, wrapped in this twilight hue, looked peaceful beyond comprehension. Its beauty was not in grandeur but in restraint, in how it held its silence with dignity, even as it grew colder with every orbit. The basin's edges grew cracked and ridged with time, as the water beneath them froze and thawed in long cycles. These fissures, like veins, spread across the surface in intricate webs. They glimmered faintly in sunlight, tracing patterns that seemed alive. Each crack was a frozen breath, a line written by the planet as it exhaled the last of its warmth. The basins were no longer seas, but memory made visible. Dust began to reclaim the shores. The winds, finding freedom in the thinning air, carried fine grains across the flats, layering them in soft dunes. Yet beneath every layer of dust was a trace of water's touch: a smooth stone, a salt ridge, a tiny ripple. Mars was wrapping its past in a blanket of red, not to erase it, but to preserve it, as though tucking a beloved story safely to sleep beneath the sand. The silence that followed was immense but tender. Without the sound of waves, the planet's pulse slowed, and its stillness deepened into something sacred. The stars reflected faintly on the frozen plains, making them look once more like liquid under moonlight. The illusion was beautiful, a final kindness from the universe, letting Mars dream of its seas even after they were gone. In the colder centuries that followed, ice advanced from the poles. It crept along valleys and settled within the basins, filling their hollows with glittering frost. These frozen seas became pale relics of their past selves, solid yet luminous under the sunlight. When the wind passed, it carried fine crystals into the air, where they sparkled briefly before falling back to rest. Mars had become an artist working in stillness, shaping frost instead of flow. Occasionally, the ground beneath the frozen seas shifted. Trapped gases escaped through cracks, creating small eruptions that reshaped the surface. The released warmth melted narrow corridors of ice, allowing for brief movements of water beneath the crust. These fleeting pulses were like heartbeats, faint reminders that deep within the stillness, Mars still remembered motion. The mineral beds beneath the seas hardened into rock, layered with iron oxides and carbonates. These strata became the planet's history books, preserving chemical signatures of every vanished wave. Scientists, billions of years later, would read them like poetry, lines of magnesium, sulfur, and chlorine speaking of a time when Mars had breathed water. Even silence, it seemed, could tell a story. The winds that danced over the frozen seas carried whispers of the past. They picked up fine grains of salt and dust, scattering them across the highlands. In each gust was a fragment of the ancient waters, molecules that had once swirled in warmth, now flying endlessly through the thin air. The basins no longer held water, but they still fed the planet, redistributing its essence with every sigh of wind. Sometimes, as the sun dipped low, faint mirages shimmered above the plains. To distant eyes, they looked like waves returning, bending light to recreate what had been lost. These illusions danced for only moments, but they felt alive, echoes of memory rising through the air. Mars was dreaming of its youth again, replaying the soft motion of its seas through the lens of light and longing. The basins, though dry, retained their curvature. They cradled the dust as they once had cradled water, holding it gently in their hollows. The landscape remained shaped by softness, rounded edges, smooth inclines, and gentle slopes. The geometry of water lingered, long after its substance had vanished. The planet had learned that memory is not what you keep, but what you shape. When the night came, it came with serenity. The twin moons traced silent arcs above the basins, their pale glow reflecting off frost and salt. Each movement of light across the surface seemed to restore a fragment of the sea's old shimmer. Mars, asleep under the vast cosmos, breathed slowly, its frozen seas glowing like quiet lanterns in the dark. Deep beneath the crust, some water still moved, not in streams, but in slow percolations through rock and ice. These secret flows carried the planet's last warmth, preserving chemistry, nurturing possibility. They were invisible rivers of persistence, connecting the present to the ancient past. Mars, though seemingly frozen, still carried the breath of its seas deep within. Eons passed, and the shallow seas became myth within the planet's body. Yet every basin still remembered its shape, its breath, its rhythm. They waited beneath the dust, not expecting return but holding faith in continuity. The planet's calm was no longer the calm of rest, but of wisdom, a stillness earned through transformation. Mars had learned to be beautiful in its quiet. And so the basins, once alive with ripples, became the lungs of memory. They no longer breathed water, but they exhaled silence, inhaled starlight. The shallow seas were gone, yet they were everywhere, in the rock, in the frost, in the whisper of wind over endless plains. Mars, serene and patient, held the memory of calm like a prayer beneath its thin, eternal sky. The sky of Mars was once not so bare, not so thin that breath would vanish before it began. In its ancient youth, the planet carried whispers of a thicker shroud, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, perhaps a trace of argon. It wasn't the kind of air that welcomed lungs, but one that held warmth close, cradling the surface against the cold silence of space. Winds moved more slowly then, brushing across plains that still remembered the rhythm of water. Each gust carried stories of a gentler Mars, one that waited patiently for something to stir within it. In that subtle glow, sunlight touched the dust with a softer hand. The air, though fragile, caught the rays and spread them wide across valleys and highlands. Faint warmth pooled near the ground, feeding dreams of life too small for eyes, too quiet for memory. Perhaps methane once rose from beneath the soil, hinting at hidden reactions, the slow dance of chemistry that flirts with the boundary between rock and living breath. Mars, in that quiet time, exhaled possibilities into its thin, reddish veil. The atmosphere shifted gently, layer by layer, forming clouds that shimmered faintly in the faint light of a distant Sunday. They drifted low over wide plains, carrying traces of moisture and the ghost of seasons. Each layer held secrets, oxygen traces that vanished as fast as they formed, and whispers of ozone trying to bloom in the thin air. It was not enough for forests or oceans, But enough to dream, enough for the planet to imagine itself alive. In those long days, dust storms were softer, not yet the all-consuming beasts they would later become. Fine grains of iron oxide floated like embers, settling over stones and ice with the patience of centuries. From orbit, the planet may have glowed faintly, like a red lantern hanging in the vast dark. Below, the air moved in slow waves, carrying warmth between dusk and dawn. The breath of Mars was light, but it was there a sign that balance once existed. Somewhere beneath that pale atmosphere, the soil began to interact with it. Minerals reacted, capturing carbon and releasing faint vapors. Chemistry became conversation. Hydrogen met oxygen, nitrogen lingered, binding with dust, forming traces of nitrates. Mars was not still, it was in constant quiet motion, breathing through the pores of its crust. It was a fragile breath, but real, a sign that the line between lifelessness and life is not always clear-cut. At night, when frost settled over the plains, the thin air carried the chill like a whisper through the canyons. The frost glittered faintly, a reflection of a smaller Sunday. As dawn approached, it evaporated, leaving behind thin streams of vapor that rose and vanished into the delicate atmosphere. That silent transformation, ice to air, cold to warmth, was Mars reminding itself that even thin breath can hold beauty. In the faint rustle of that atmosphere, sound itself was different. Voices would not travel far. The wind, when it moved, made almost no sound at all. Yet if one could listen closely, there might be the faint sigh of carbon dioxide shifting, expanding, cooling the planet's soft, invisible pulse. Mars was quiet, but not empty. Its silence carried weight, the way a sleeping body holds the trace of dreams. Tiny storms of dust rose from time to time, swirling gently before fading away. They shaped the dunes, sculpted soft hills, and painted patterns on ancient stone. Each gust carried a bit of memory, the scentless dust of volcanoes long cold, the residue of water once flowing. Even in stillness, the air moved, its thinness unable to erase the feeling that something was always trying to breathe. The balance was delicate. Too much sunlight, and molecules fled to space. Too little volcanic breath, and the air thinned beyond recovery. Yet for millions of years, Mars managed to hold that line, sustaining just enough of a sky to cradle warmth and chemistry. It was a world in delicate suspense, a living pause between abundance and emptiness. The sun's warmth danced on the edge of survival, never quite enough to lift the air higher, yet never too weak to let it vanish entirely. On the horizon, the light bent through the thin gas, painting the sky with strange colors, pinks at dawn, deep copper at dusk. It was not the blue of Earth, but something gentler, as though the planet preferred its quiet reds and oranges. In that era, perhaps microbes stirred, invisible, fleeting, testing the boundary between mineral and life. If they existed, they would have breathed differently, drawing what they could from a stingy sky. Maybe beneath the surface, in pockets warmed by ancient heat, reactions continued, carbon joining with hydrogen, oxygen waiting its turn. The air above carried hints of this silent experiment, a breath too faint to prove, yet too steady to deny. Over time, the thin air began to betray its keeper. Solar winds brushed against it, stealing atoms away. The magnetic shield had weakened, leaving Mars exposed to the raw tide of particles from the sun. Slowly, invisibly, its breath began to fade. What once was a veil of warmth turned fragile, threadbare, trembling under cosmic touch. The planet began to forget the sound of its own exhale. Even as it thinned, the air remained graceful. High above, wisps of vapor froze into cirrus clouds that drifted like thoughts. They stretched and dissolved, giving the sky a translucent depth, as though one could see the edge of silence itself. On the surface, shadows lengthened, moving gently across stone as the world cooled. The atmosphere, though weak, was a painter, its brush made of time. The seasons still turned, though faintly. Polar caps grew and shrank, exhaling carbon dioxide into the air during summer, reclaiming it in winter. This rhythm was the planet's heartbeat, steady but slowing. Even now, traces of that breath linger, caught between ice and dust, waiting for warmth to call them forth again. If one could stand on that ancient Mars and look up, they would see a sky that felt both close and infinite. The stars would shimmer more sharply, yet the air would carry a softness, a tint of rose. The sun, smaller than from Earth's view, would cast long, golden shadows. The horizon would breathe faintly, like the chest of a sleeping giant. Each dusk carried a melancholy beauty. The last warmth of the day met the thin coolness of the night, and frost began to whisper its way across the rocks. In that moment, the air held a balance between life and loss, a silent reminder that even in fading, beauty persists. Mars exhaled slowly, as though reluctant to let go of its dream. The dust in the air told stories that light alone could not. It caught the sun rays and scattered them into pale halos around distant hills. Every mote was a memory of wind, of warmth, of waiting. The planet's thin breath held them all, carrying them endlessly across deserts that once were deltas. In the soft glow of twilight, Mars seemed almost alive. The thin air shimmered faintly, and the cold could not erase its quiet dignity. The planet's atmosphere might have been retreating, but its presence remained in every ripple of dust, every ghost of a cloud, every shifting hue. It was a fading breath, but still a breath nonetheless. As ages passed, the atmosphere thinned further, until its whisper became silence. Yet traces endured: frozen carbon dioxide beneath the poles, trapped gases beneath rocks. Mars still remembers what it was like to breathe. Each sunrise that burns the frost, each gust of wind that stirs the dust, is the planet's way of recalling the life it almost had. Now, in the present, the air of Mars is only a shadow of that old breath. But it carries the memory of time, a billion years of quiet exhalation, of sunlight touching red plains and the faint murmur of wind over stone. The sky, though thin, still holds that story in its copper light. Mars may not breathe as it once did, yet in its silence, it continues to remember. In the waning warmth of early Mars, when water still clung to shadows and the air carried whispers of life, the ground itself became a cradle. Beneath layers of dust and stone, clay minerals began to form, soft, fine, patient. These clays were the silent architects of hope, their surfaces sticky with potential. They gathered organic fragments from sunlight, from reactions between minerals and gases, and held them close. Within their layered embrace, chemistry began to dream of something more, something that might one day awaken. The rocks of Mars were not just cold witnesses, they were participants. Basalts cracked and cooled, mingling with flowing water, releasing iron, magnesium, and silica into shallow pools. From this alchemy, clays emerged: montmorillonite, nontronite, kaolinite, each one shaped by ancient warmth and moisture. These minerals absorbed simple carbon molecules, trapping them between layers where radiation could not reach. It was in this shelter that the story of possibility began to unfold, molecule by molecule, reaction by reaction. In the faint sunlight, these minerals shimmered like ancient scrolls, their surfaces etched by the touch of time. Water ran across them in rivulets, thin but persistent, weaving new combinations of elements. Each drop carried whispers of hydrogen and oxygen, weaving with iron and carbon in fragile balance. If Mars had a pulse then, it beat beneath the surface, deep in the pores of clay, in the microchambers where warmth lingered long enough for something gentle to form. The air above may have grown thinner, but underground, the story thickened. Tiny voids in the rock became laboratories of creation, where pressure, minerals, and water mingled in slow harmony. It was chemistry without eyes, without mind, but not without meaning. Energy from the planet's fading heart and sunlight filtering through dust combined to drive reactions that could build not life yet, but the scaffolding upon which life might rest. When the sun dipped low, frost crept into crevices and dissolved minerals anew. As it melted, it left behind traces of salt and clay, restructuring the ground again and again. This slow breathing of freeze and thaw acted as a natural rhythm, a planetary heartbeat, gently mixing the ingredients of potential. Mars, through its quiet patience, was preparing itself layer by layer for the faintest whisper of biological thought. Over time, the rocks began to change color, touched by oxidation and age. Red from iron, gray from basalt, greenish hues from phyllosilicates that once met water. Each hue was a sentence in Mars' long geological poem. In those colors lay a record of warmth and reaction, proof that the planet once fostered the conditions for complexity. It was not yet alive, but it was ready to host something that could be. Deep in sheltered valleys and crater basins, sediments piled softly. Each flood or rain left behind thin layers of fine clay and dust, pressing together over eons. Between these layers, tiny voids trapped ancient organics, carbon chains, nitrogen fragments, whispers of methane. The rocks became memory keepers, preserving the story of chemical longing in their quiet interiors. Even now, some of those memories rest untouched beneath Mars' cold skin. Beneath the ancient lake beds, minerals crystallized like frozen thoughts. They captured the essence of time, preserving within them traces of water that no longer flowed. Scientists on distant worlds, millennia later, would read these minerals like messages, clues that Mars was once more than stone, once a place where reactions might have learned to feel. The clay, unknowing but enduring, became a time capsule of hope. In the quiet shelters between grains, protection was key. Ultraviolet light from the distant sun beat down on the surface, relentless, stripping molecules apart. But under a thin veil of dust and clay, shadows preserved what light would destroy. The rocks became guardians, keeping fragile chemistry alive. These safe pockets might have cradled the earliest experiments of molecular complexity, the soft murmur of structure forming from chaos. As the years turned into millions, Mars' skin cracked and settled. Hydrothermal vents beneath volcanic plains sent warmth upward, infusing rock with energy. Water, heated by these secret fires, circulated through fractures, carrying minerals that nourished chemistry anew. Each vent, each seep, was a small workshop of creation, hidden from the cold air above but alive in its own silent rhythm. Even the iron that stained the ground red played its part. It shifted oxidation states, transferring electrons, generating faint energy gradients, the same kind of gentle imbalance that life thrives on. In that quiet, buried world, reactions sparked, faltered, and began again. There was no rush, no witness, only the patient dialogue between rock and water, mineral and molecule. Somewhere in the cracks of time, carbon met clay and lingered. The surfaces of those minerals were perfect hosts, charged, reactive, full of hidden corners. There, organic molecules might have found refuge, linking together, growing slightly more complex with each season. Mars, without intention, was shaping the foundations of something tender, not consciousness, but the soil from which it could one day bloom. Above, the thin air danced with dust storms that sometimes reached across the planet. Each storm lifted particles of clay high into the atmosphere, scattering them like pollen. When the storms settled, those grains fell anew, carrying traces of chemistry to new regions. Mars was spreading its seeds of possibility, unknowingly cultivating its own ancient soil. In the basins that once held lakes, sediments thickened. Beneath these layers, pressure and mild warmth formed patterns, banded strata that marked each era of flooding and retreat. Within these patterns, minerals grew like quiet reefs, each a record of long-forgotten calm. Scientists would one day study these formations and wonder, was this where the first whispers of life began to stir? The planet's surface was not a place of abundance, but of resilience. Even in its harshness, there was gentleness in the way water once shaped stone, in the way clay wrapped around the smallest fragments of carbon. Each mineral, each grain of dust, became a participant in the story of potential. The planet's patience was infinite, its hope stored deep in the red bones of its crust. Beneath Olympus Mons and the great volcanic plains, hydrothermal systems pulsed like veins. They released warmth, minerals, and gas, feeding the underworld of chemistry. There, sheltered from radiation, reactions continued in the darkness. The rock walls sweated with condensation, their surfaces lined with minerals that might once have trapped the building blocks of life. Mars' deepest places were its most alive. On the surface, winds carved stones into smooth shapes, rounding them with the persistence of centuries. The clays below weathered slowly, their soft forms retaining moisture long after the air above had frozen. These were not dead places, they were cradles waiting for warmth to return. Even now, robotic wanderers can find remnants of these old shelters, their quiet forms whispering of times when Mars was still breathing softly. The chemistry of life is shy, easily destroyed, easily forgotten. Yet Mars protected it for a time. The rocks and clays were its keepers, its silent monasteries of possibility. In those microscopic chambers, The seeds of something miraculous may have waited, not yet alive, but ready, just as a spark waits within the flint, unlit but eternal in its patience. Over eons, the surface cooled and the atmosphere fled. The water retreated to ice, and the clays hardened, locking their secrets inside. But the patterns they left, layered, folded, and bright with mineral fingerprints, tell the story of that long era of protection. The shelters remained, even when their purpose had long passed. Now, when rovers brush their instruments against ancient rocks, they awaken those memories again. In the spectra of minerals and the traces of organic molecules, we hear echoes of that ancient chemistry. It is as if Mars still whispers to us, "I once held warmth. I once held promise." The clays speak the language of time, their silence full of meaning. Perhaps, deep below, some of those processes continue still. In briny pockets or ice fractures, faint energy might still coax carbon and hydrogen into dance. The rock remembers how to host such things. It needs only warmth, only time. Mars' story of creation may not be over. It may simply be sleeping, buried beneath its red dust. As dust settles over these old shelters, the planet's heart grows quieter. But the evidence remains: the chemistry, the minerals, the scars left by flowing water. Mars was a sculptor, and the medium was its own body. Every stone holds the ghost of that first attempt to nurture something more than mere matter. The clays, now cold and dry, still cling to their last traces of bound water. They have not forgotten the touch of moisture or the warmth of light. Each layer is a relic of gentleness, a memory of the time when Mars breathed beneath soft skies. They are the bones of its forgotten garden. In the stillness of the Martian night, when frost drapes the plains and stars shimmer like distant eyes, those ancient rocks continue their vigil. They have outlasted oceans, storms, and time itself. And though the chemistry they once protected has long fallen silent, the possibility they once held still lingers, not gone, but waiting. Even in silence, Mars teaches that creation begins not with abundance, but with shelter. It reminds us that sometimes, all life needs to begin is a safe place to rest, a little warmth, and the patience of stone. Before the silence of Mars became eternal, there may have been mornings unlike any the planet has known since, pale dawns when warmth lingered just long enough for molecules to try something new. Beneath the soft veil of clay and stone, something stirred. It wasn't movement as we know it, but a trembling in the chemistry, a hint of order where before there was none. Complex molecules aligned, folded, and joined. It was not yet life, but it was closer than chance. Mars inhaled softly through its thin air, and deep within, chemistry dreamed of awakening. Water, the old sculptor of worlds, was the silent midwife of these beginnings. In small pockets beneath the soil, it pooled and seeped, touching mineral and molecule alike. Every droplet was a tiny world, full of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus elements that craved connection. The warmth of ancient hydrothermal vents stirred the mix, whispering energy into motion. There, in the dim glow of minerals, chains of molecules began to lengthen, form loops, and sometimes, miraculously, repair themselves. They were still too simple to be called alive, but they had begun to persist. Clay minerals played their gentle role, offering shelter and guidance. Their layered surfaces acted like scripts, guiding molecules to assemble in patterns that favored survival. In those microchambers, chemistry began to resemble memory, repeating, adapting, testing its own form. The thin air above did not matter. Below the surface, warmth and patience were enough. In these quiet corners, Mars was not a barren desert, but a nursery of whispers, where invisible hands shaped the first hints of continuity. Each reaction was a conversation between chance and time. The molecules that lasted learned stability from minerals, structure from temperature, and renewal from water's persistence. They split and reformed, never truly alive, yet never fully dead. Mars itself seemed to be learning through them, a planet experimenting with self-organization, writing and erasing its first biological drafts on clay parchment. And though most attempts faded into dust, some lingered a moment longer than before. As ages passed, certain compounds began to dominate. Fatty layers formed thin membranes, wrapping around fragile interiors like protective skin. Inside these primitive bubbles, other molecules began to work together, absorbing energy, sharing reactions, dividing when stretched thin. It was a moment of balance, fragile and miraculous. Life, as the universe understands it, may have been only a breath away. Mars' surface was cold, but its heart, through chemistry, had begun to warm. In the soft dawns of these early ages, the light was weak but golden. It filtered through the thin sky, touching shallow pools and moist sediments. Sunlight catalyzed reactions that water alone could not, photochemical awakenings that built sugars, amino acids, and fragile chains of RNA-like structures. Each beam was a teacher, teaching matter how to become memory. The pools shimmered faintly, their ripples carrying more meaning than anyone could yet name. The first mornings of Mars were quiet, but alive with potential. Beneath the frost and stone, the planet hummed with chemical rhythm, not consciousness, but direction. The reactions learned to self-sustain, fed by volcanic heat, protected by mineral walls. When cold struck, ice preserved them. When warmth returned, motion resumed. The cycle continued endlessly, a rehearsal for life's first steps. Mars was not yet living, but it had begun to practice. In some small cavities near the edges of old lakes, organic matter concentrated. Salts and clays worked together, holding moisture through cold nights, keeping chemistry from dispersing. It was here, perhaps, that the first protocells formed, fragile, translucent bubbles drifting in still water. They might have moved slightly with currents, or clung to the sides of rock. They had no thought, no will, yet they had structure. They persisted. They changed. And in their endurance, they whispered the first syllables of life's language. Not all survived. Most were destroyed by cold, radiation, or collapse. But every failure left behind fragments, molecular fossils that taught the next generation to endure longer, to adapt better. It was evolution before biology, selection before cells. Mars itself was the teacher and the test, sculpting life's precursors through pressure and patience. Even as the air grew thinner and the seas began to vanish, chemistry refused to stop learning. Deep in cracks where light could not reach, warmth still lingered from the planet's molten heart. Hydrothermal flows provided a steady rhythm of temperature and minerals, much like the deep-sea vents of Earth's later oceans. Here, molecules danced in the dark, forming new bonds, testing new shapes. They learned to capture small bursts of energy, to store them, to release them again, the first flickers of metabolism. It was not intelligence, but instinct, born from the logic of nature. The faintest electric charges may have pulsed through minerals, mimicking the sparks that on Earth once ignited similar reactions. These microcurrents breathed movement into still waters, coaxing chains of atoms into complexity. With every flicker, Mars came closer to creating something truly alive. But the world above grew harsher, its warmth slipping away, its sky unraveling. The window of opportunity was closing, even as life's spark reached for the surface. Those who might have called Mars home never saw the light of day. The surface, though once kind, became hostile, stripped by solar winds, chilled by endless frost. Yet below, in the buried veins of clay and ice, faint communities of molecules continued their quiet work. If any life existed then, it would have been microscopic, unseen, and fragile. It would have known only darkness, warmth, and persistence, the three great teachers of beginnings. Even if they never became true organisms, these molecular patterns left traces in the rocks. The clays that once nurtured them retained their fingerprints, isotopic clues, organic residues, and mineral arrangements that hinted at their passing. To us, they are fossils not of creatures, but of possibilities. Mars, though it never became an Eden, became a mirror of what life tries to do everywhere, to find a foothold, even when the ground is slipping away. The sky above these hidden reactions changed, turning thinner, colder, lonelier. But still, beneath its watch, Mars' surface and subsurface carried on their delicate chemistry. Some molecules retreated deeper underground, carried by infiltrating water or shifting sediments. The planet's crust became both grave and guardian, sealing away what might have been, preserving it against time's erosion. If one could travel back and stand in that era, the world might have seemed quiet, yet beneath one's feet, it would have been alive in motionless ways. Chemical pulses moving through tiny water films, reactions blooming and fading, networks of molecules testing structure like breath against glass. Every grain of clay was a universe of trial and repetition, and every failure was a step toward greater resilience. In those days, Mars mornings would begin with frost melting on stone, creating fleeting rivulets that carried dissolved minerals into hidden basins. These tiny flows fed the chemistry of creation, renewing what night's cold had slowed. It was a balance between destruction and regeneration, a cycle as old as time itself. Every sunrise was a quiet act of rebirth, a new chance for life to find itself. The thin warmth of sunlight also meant exposure. The surface, once kind, became a battlefield between creation and decay. Radiation split molecules apart, while shadows sheltered others. The struggle was silent but unending. Even as energy tore things down, it also forged new connections, a paradox that life itself would later inherit. Out of destruction came diversity, and from diversity, the chance for survival. Slowly, the chemical reactions began to build small networks, feedback loops where one product became another's fuel. This was the first whisper of metabolism, the quiet hum of systems that could sustain themselves. In these tiny, microscopic mornings, Mars had nearly everything it needed. Only time and warmth were missing, and those, the planet could not hold for long. As centuries became millions of years, these fragile systems retreated deeper, following warmth downward. The surface froze, but underground, water remained liquid for a while longer. The cradle of creation shifted into the shadows, sustained by geothermal whispers. There, the first Martian microlife, or something resembling it, may have taken its final breaths before the cold sealed it away forever. Even as the planet cooled and the atmosphere fled, some of those chemical traces endured. Encased in rock, they became eternal witnesses, silent, unrecognizable, yet still telling a story. When rovers today uncover carbon signatures or clays rich in organics, they are touching those old echoes. Mars does not speak, but its stones remember. In the stillness of the present, the question remains, did those microscopic mornings truly give rise to life, or did Mars' song stop before its melody began? We may never know, yet the evidence whispers otherwise. The conditions were right, the ingredients perfect, the patience infinite. It was a world on the edge of awakening. Perhaps, somewhere beneath its frozen crust even now, some trace of that early chemistry survives. Maybe a dormant molecule still waits for warmth, like a dream waiting for dawn. Mars is not a dead world, only a sleeping one, its breath shallow, but not gone. The memory of its microscopic mornings lingers, like the faintest pulse beneath the dust. And so, Mars teaches us that life's beginnings need not be loud or visible. They can exist in silence, in stillness, in invisible persistence. The smallest molecules, working together in darkness, can create the foundation for something that might one day sing. Life is not always born in glory, sometimes it begins in whispers too small to hear. Even now, the planet carries that legacy. Its clays hold the fingerprints of creation, its stones echo with the patterns of reaction. To look at Mars is to look at a frozen dawn, the moment before breath became life. It reminds us that beginnings, no matter how faint, never truly vanish. They linger in matter, in memory, and in the dust. Between stars. In those early ages, Mars was both cradle and tomb. But in that duality lies its beauty, for in every failed attempt at life, the universe learned a little more about how to live. And though the mornings of Mars are now cold and still, their memory remains warm in the story of creation itself, where even silence holds the promise of a heartbeat. In the hush of ancient Martian plains, chemistry whispered where voices could not. Atoms met beneath veils of thin air, drawn together by a faint warmth that still lingered from the planet's youth. Reactions did not rush here, they lingered, taking their time, as if the world itself wanted to savor the smallest shift. Minerals cradled elements like secret keepers, letting hydrogen, carbon, and sulfur dance in hidden patterns. What Earth would do in hours, Mars did in millennia, each change deliberate, each bond a sigh. Deep within pools that shimmered under a pale sun, molecules drifted like sleepy thoughts. Water, rare and precious, acted as the slow rhythm that kept the reactions alive. It lapped softly against clay beds, coaxing metals to dissolve and recombine, weaving fragile threads of potential. These were not sparks of life yet, but the patient rehearsal before the performance. Mars, though quiet, had not fallen silent. In every molecule, a tiny negotiation was taking place, a whisper between matter and time. Crystals began to grow in the shallow sediments, locking chemical secrets inside their structures. Iron stained them red, while salts drew patterns on the edges of ancient ponds. The slow evaporation of these pools left traces of reactions still frozen in place, like faint echoes of invisible hands. Beneath, warmth from the crust kept certain spots alive, pockets where chemistry continued in dim persistence. These oases of reaction were Mars's secret laboratories, where slow creation replaced violent change. The air above remained thin and calm, letting radiation from the sun strike the surface unhindered. Yet even this harshness shaped chemistry in unseen ways. Ultraviolet light teased reactions into motion, breaking bonds, forming new ones, driving the cycle onward. Mars was learning to balance between destruction and creation, between silence and subtle energy. In the quiet, progress moved without noise, invisible but real, shaping dust, stone, and shadow alike. The rocks themselves became participants in this silent dialogue. Minerals acted as surfaces for molecules to gather upon, guiding their assembly with patient precision. Carbon dioxide from the air seeped into cracks, reacting with the crust, creating carbonates that told the story of time's slow breath. Nothing rushed. The planet's rhythm had changed, slowed, yet deep beneath that pace was intention, chemistry still unfolding, still dreaming of something more complex. Raindrops, rare but powerful, fell and vanished, leaving traces of reaction wherever they touched. Each droplet carried dissolved minerals, sparking microbursts of transformation before drying into ghostly outlines. Over countless years, these traces accumulated, creating thin films of altered rock, the planet's own canvas painted by invisible brushes. If one could watch in deep time, one would see the surface shimmer in perpetual, delicate renewal. In the shadow of canyons, protected from harsh radiation, reactions continued in dim recesses. Here, clay minerals absorbed organic molecules from the thin atmosphere or meteoritic dust. These clays, layered like old pages, preserved what the wind would have erased. Between their sheets, tiny spaces offered protection, warmth, and a stage for chemical choreography. Even in their stillness, these rocks held potential, the soft chemistry that marks the boundary between the inert and the alive. As ice formed in the colder regions, chemical processes slowed further, yet they did not stop. Within that ice, atoms arranged themselves in precise, repeating patterns, capturing faint traces of organic matter from ancient times. Each layer of frost carried memory, an archive of reactions frozen mid-sentence. In this slow freezing, Mars recorded the story of its own chemistry, preserving what it could not yet awaken. Occasionally, meteorites struck the surface, briefly reigniting chemistry with sudden heat and pressure. These violent intrusions stirred what had settled, mixing layers, melting pockets of ice, and creating fleeting windows of warmth. For a moment, reactions accelerated, a quickened heartbeat in the planet's otherwise slow rhythm. Yet as the heat faded, the stillness returned, and with it, the patient continuation of Mars's long chemical meditation. In the underground aquifers, deep where the surface's chill could not reach, chemistry thrived in shadows. Minerals dissolved and reformed in the slow seep of ancient water, their changes almost imperceptible. Here, hydrogen met sulfur and iron, creating faint murmurs of energy enough, perhaps, to nudge matter toward new forms. If life were ever to take root, it would begin here, where chemistry did not sleep, but waited. Time became the sculptor of reactions. Over millions of years, the same cycles repeated, deepening the patterns. The planet's crust absorbed and released gases, its rocks cycling through oxidation and renewal. Each slow process left marks that no wind could erase, subtle chemical fingerprints etched into stone. Mars was building memory, not through biology, but through the persistence of transformation. The atmosphere continued to thin, stealing away some of the elements needed for faster change. Yet this loss gave the remaining reactions focus, narrowing their playground but deepening their precision. The slow chemistry became more selective, more intimate, as if the planet was choosing its pathways carefully. Even in scarcity, The quiet beauty of transformation endured chemistry as meditation, not frenzy. Meteoritic dust continued to rain down, rich with organic molecules from far-off places. Each particle brought fragments of carbon chains, amino acids, and other building blocks. The planet's surface absorbed these like soft notes in an old melody, letting them mingle with what it already held. In these minglings, faint possibilities stirred patterns that hinted at self-organization, at the whisper of structure seeking meaning. The winds that swept across the plains carried dust full of mineral catalysts, scattering them across vast distances. When they settled, new chemical opportunities arose, a molecule meeting a mineral face it had never known. These random meetings formed the quiet pulse of Martian progress. Nothing grand, nothing sudden, but always moving, always tending toward complexity even when unseen. Volcanic gases still seeped from cracks in the crust, bringing warmth and volatile compounds to the surface. Around these vents, chemistry found brief vigor, bubbles of energy pushing reactions forward. Sulfur and hydrogen mingled in ways that spoke of Earth's early days, a faint mirror of potential. The volcanoes may have gone quiet, but their echoes continued through these invisible exchanges. In the silence of the Martian night, frost condensed on the rocks, only to vanish with dawn. This daily rhythm added another layer of reaction, expanding and contracting minerals, drawing in gases, releasing others. Mars had its own breath, not biological, but geological, a cycle of condensation, oxidation, and release that shaped both air and stone. Slowly, the surface became a mosaic of chemical ages, each region holding its own timeline of reaction. Some places rich in salts and clay bore witness to wetter days. Others, coated in iron oxides, marked dryness and loss. Each pattern told a story of chemistry finding balance with circumstance, adjusting with grace to the planet's fading warmth. Even without life, Mars carried the marks of patience. The processes that unfolded upon it did not seek to rush into form. They lingered, allowing the smallest details to take centuries to emerge. This was a chemistry of quiet faith, one that believed, perhaps unknowingly, that given enough time, even dust might dream of breath. The crust became both witness and participant, holding on to gases that the air could not. Its porous layers allowed tiny, unseen movements of carbon dioxide and methane, slow exchanges that kept the world breathing in its own muted way. These were faint rhythms, yet they mattered, giving Mars a heartbeat even in stillness. Through all this, light continued to play its role, breaking and mending bonds, tracing energy across the land. Every photon carried the memory of a distant sun, its warmth both gift and challenge. Mars absorbed what it could, letting the rest pass through, the balance of endurance and surrender written into every grain of sand. Perhaps the greatest miracle of all was not the creation of life, but the persistence of potential. Even as the atmosphere thinned and the cold deepened, chemistry refused to stop. It adapted, slowed, but never died. Like a candle's glow in vast darkness, it endured not to become something more, but because persistence itself was its quiet purpose. And so, in the slow rhythm of time, Mars continued to breathe through reactions unseen. Its quiet chemistry shaped its stones, colored its valleys, and whispered through its dust. No noise, no movement, only the patient unfolding of nature's will. On this planet of silence, change became prayer, gentle, enduring, and infinite. Beneath Mars's frozen crust, where sunlight no longer reached, warmth lingered like a secret sigh. The surface may have turned cold and harsh, but deep below, the planet's heart still glowed faintly. Heat from the core radiated upward, seeping through fractures, cracks, and ancient volcanic roots. It met buried pockets of ice, whispering them into meltwater, drop by patient drop. These hidden springs were quiet sanctuaries, worlds within a world, where chemistry, motion, and warmth intertwined in solitude. Each spring existed like a fragile heartbeat beneath the still skin of the planet. Warm water trickled through mineral veins, carrying with it traces of sulfur, iron, and carbon compounds. These flows, slow but constant, created soft currents underground, carving paths that had no witness. If one could listen closely, perhaps the sound of these faint rivers might echo like distant breath, a reminder that Mars was not as lifeless as it seemed. The springs pulsed with the rhythm of geological persistence, small proofs of endurance in the planet's cold decline. Around these hidden reservoirs, the rock glowed faintly from the geothermal warmth. Minerals changed form under pressure, crystallizing in patterns unique to such secret depths. Iron met sulfur, forming pyrite and other compounds that shimmered like tiny stars trapped within stone. Here, chemistry thrived in quiet abundance, not fierce or fast, but steady, deliberate. Every molecule played its part in keeping the underground alive, shaping pockets where possibility could still rest. In these dark places, temperature was not the enemy but the protector. The overlying crust acted as a blanket, shielding the fragile warmth from the desolate winds above. Radiation rarely touched these depths, allowing complex reactions to proceed without disruption. The balance was delicate but profound. Here, Mars nurtured its last remnants of internal fire, offering them to water, to minerals, and to time itself. The result was an unseen harmony, one that echoed the planet's distant past. The springs were ancient, perhaps as old as the first volcanoes that once towered over the plains. Their origins lay in the deep fractures left behind by cooling lava, where pressure and heat conspired to keep water liquid. Over eons, as the planet's energy waned, these fractures became narrow veins of persistence, holding onto warmth like fading embers. Yet within these veins, reactions never ceased. The minerals continued to trade electrons, the gases continued to form, and the chemistry kept its slow pulse. Some of these hidden springs may have erupted long ago, sending geysers of warm, mineral-rich water up to the frozen surface. The evidence remains: channels carved by sudden outflows, deposits of salts and clays in curious formations. Each pattern tells of a moment when the underground reached out, offering its warmth to the barren world above. But those moments were fleeting. The springs retreated, sealing themselves once more in the silence below, away from the cruel vacuum of the Martian air. Beneath the crust, the water carried whispers of life's earliest recipes. It moved through porous rocks, dissolving and redistributing elements like a patient alchemist. Sulfates, carbonates, and silicates mixed and separated, forming layers that recorded each transformation. The chemistry here was not chaos but dialogue, a steady exchange between stone and liquid, heat and cold, potential and patience. Mars, though still, was never truly at rest. At times, pressure from the interior forced gases to escape through cracks, creating bubbling vents in the hidden pools. These bursts carried methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, faint traces of ongoing reactions. Some scientists on distant Earth would one day see these gases as clues, wondering if life once shared this warmth. But for now, they were only the breath of the planet itself, a slow exhalation of the deep. The walls of these underground chambers shimmered with deposits of salt and mineral crystals. Over time, as water flowed and receded, layers formed in rings, marking cycles of activity. Like the growth rings of trees, they told stories of renewal and dormancy, of warmth found and lost again. The springs may have pulsed with the rhythm of Mars's internal tides, influenced by the pull of its distant moons. In this hidden rhythm, one could almost hear the echo of ancient oceans, long vanished but not forgotten. Sometimes, the water froze in place, creating patterns of expansion and fracture that mimicked the veins of a living creature. When warmth returned from volcanic movement or pressure shifts, those same veins melted once more, sending faint trickles into new paths. The result was an ever-changing network of subsurface motion, unseen but enduring. Each thaw and freeze wrote another verse in the long poem of Martian persistence. Even as the surface froze solid, deep reservoirs remained liquid, protected by layers of insulating ice and salt. These briny pockets could stay fluid far below the freezing point of pure water. They became small worlds unto themselves, isolated, enduring, and possibly nurturing the faint chemistry of self-organization. In such places, life, if it ever emerged, might have learned to wait. Over millions of years, the underground warmth waned but did not disappear. Pockets of magma far below continued to release energy slowly, feeding thermal gradients that stretched upward. These gradients kept the water moving, circulating through minerals and reacting along the way. The planet's quiet fire had learned restraint, no longer violent or volcanic, but steady, breathing through stone. The deeper one descended, the more alien the chemistry became. Pressures rose, temperatures climbed, and new minerals formed rare combinations of metal, gas, and crystal. The colors here were strange: greens of olivine, reds of hematite, silvers of pyroxene, all mingling in dim light. If one could look upon it, it would seem like a subterranean dreamscape, painted not by hands but by time itself. Above, where the crust thinned, warmth occasionally reached nearer the surface. These areas became special, potential windows between the deep and the open air. The Viking and Curiosity landers would one day find traces hinting at such places, where heat and hydration still whispered faintly. Mars, in its restraint, had hidden its living warmth well, but not perfectly. The signs of its inner breath remained for those who knew how to see. The hidden springs shaped the planet's future even after they cooled. The salts they deposited changed the way light reflected from the ground, tinting plains and valleys in subtle hues. Iron oxides deepened into reds, sulfates shimmered pale against the dust, and clay minerals softened the landscape's harshness. Mars wore the fingerprints of its inner warmth across its silent face. The ancient chemistry of these springs may have seeded the foundations of organic molecules that still linger. Trapped in rock pores, encased in salt, they survived eons of radiation from above. Perhaps one day they will be found not as living things, but as fossils of possibility, as frozen whispers of what might have been. Life may not have flourished here, but its ingredients had a home. The subterranean warmth also carved voids, caverns, and channels, safe havens beneath the planet's harsh skin. In these caves, frost met heat in delicate balance, creating cycles of condensation that nourished chemical continuity. If any remnants of microbes endured after the surface froze, they would have hidden here, in the womb-like protection of Mars's quiet heat. Each spring told a story not of fire and chaos, but of endurance and adaptation. Mars learned to sustain without eruption, to nurture quietly beneath the cold. It carried forward the memory of its once-living heart, transforming it into patience. In those secret depths, warmth was not destruction but memory, a gentle persistence against the void. When meteorites struck, some of these underground sanctuaries cracked open, releasing steam and minerals to the surface. For brief moments, the planet's hidden warmth kissed the frozen plains, sculpting patterns that would last for eons. These fleeting outbursts reminded the world, and someday, those who studied it, that beneath the cold silence, Mars was still breathing softly. The heat that powered these springs came from the decay of ancient radioactive elements deep within the core. It was a slow kind of energy, the quiet release of what once burned brightly. This process would last for billions of years, gradually dimming but never fully ceasing. It was enough to keep a few hidden corners alive, enough to resist the total stillness of death. In some places, the rock walls of the chambers glowed faintly under chemical reactions, like embers that refused to fade. Gas bubbles formed and burst, sending ripples through the dark pools. The sound would have been barely audible, soft clicks, faint echoes, yet each was a reminder that motion still existed in this buried world. As centuries turned to millennia, the springs moved deeper, retreating from the cooling crust above. Their paths changed, their shapes evolved, but their essence remained the same: warmth-seeking purpose. Mars was rewriting its own interior, sculpting new layers of stone and salt around these ancient flows, preserving them like veins of memory. The warmth below became the soul of the planet, unseen but vital. It was not meant to create life anymore, perhaps, but to remember it. To hold on to the chemistry, the motion, and the whispers that once promised something greater. Even in its solitude, Mars continued to nurture the echoes of its potential. Above, the red deserts stretched endlessly, windblown and barren. But beneath, warmth pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. It was faint, patient, and eternal, a quiet defiance against the cold. These hidden springs, ancient and unseen, carried the planet's last song, not one of loss, but of endurance. Mars had not died, it had simply learned to dream beneath the surface. In the vast timeline of the cosmos, these underground currents would continue long after the stars that once warmed Mars dimmed. They would remain as proof that even silence can harbor energy, that even frozen worlds can cradle fire. And so, in the unseen depths of A red world, warmth still moved slowly, gently waiting for someone, someday, to listen. The sun rose over Mars with a cold brilliance, casting sharp shadows across its silent plains. Light spread thinly through the dusty air, diffused by particles that painted the sky in soft tones of peach and rust. Each dawn seemed both promise and warning, warmth that would fade too quickly, brightness that revealed the scars of ages. The planet endured it all quietly, adjusting, surviving, remembering. In every ridge and crater, light battled shadow, and both were needed for Mars to remain what it had become: resilient, ancient, and still. The thin atmosphere could not soften the sun's touch. Its rays struck the ground with unfiltered precision, heating rocks that cooled again the moment night returned. This daily dance of extremes carved patience into the land. Minerals cracked and healed, dunes shifted and resettled, all under the gaze of a sun that neither comforted nor destroyed completely. It was a relationship of endurance, a test of equilibrium where each dawn brought both pain and continuation. Shadows became sanctuaries. Within their cool embrace, ice lingered a little longer, and chemical traces resisted decay. The light would scorch and fade, but shadows preserved, holding time itself in pause. Beneath overhangs, within crater walls, and under scattered boulders, Mars hid its gentler moments. Here, frost collected each morning, glinting like silent hope before dissolving into the dry wind. Even in desolation, there were patterns of persistence, small, subtle, beautiful. The winds swept across the plains like restless memories, lifting fine dust into shimmering curtains. When sunlight struck these veils, it scattered in luminous waves, painting the air with motion. The light was not warm, but it was alive, tracing the invisible dance of the atmosphere's thin breath. Over billions of years, these winds sculpted the planet's face, smoothing rocks, hollowing canyons, and shaping dunes that stretched like whispers across eternity. During the long days, rocks absorbed what little heat they could, storing it in silence. When darkness fell, that stored warmth seeped back into the air, creating faint mirages near the ground, illusions of motion, echoes of energy refusing to fade. The balance between light and shadow gave Mars its rhythm, brief flashes of warmth followed by long descents into chill. In those transitions, the planet's soul seemed to flicker. Not alive, but not entirely dead. As the sun arced low across the horizon, shadows stretched endlessly, painting the terrain with depth and solitude. Each rock cast a story, each dune a silhouette of survival. The light was sharp but fleeting, like the last word of a long-forgotten song. It touched the frozen peaks of volcanoes, glinted off iron dust, and traced the ancient flow lines of vanished rivers. The land seemed to glow from within, reflecting not just sunlight, but the memory of warmth it once held in abundance. At the poles, the contrast was sharper still. Vast fields of frost shimmered like glass under the morning light, only to retreat with the first wave of heat. The carbon dioxide ice sublimated into mist, forming ghostly clouds that drifted across the thin sky. When the light returned days or months later, it found new shapes, new patterns carved by the quiet dance of freezing and thawing. Mars did not resist the light or the shadow, it surrendered to both with grace. Dust storms became the planet's great curtain calls, veiling everything in copper fog. The sun dimmed, reduced to a weak, blurred disk. Yet even then, the play between shadow and light continued. Inside the storm, lightning sometimes flashed, illuminating the world in strange, otherworldly bursts. Energy still moved through the air, fragile but unstoppable. It was as if Mars itself was remembering how to breathe in chaos. Between day and night, during the long twilight hours, the surface glowed faintly with residual heat. Shadows softened, and the horizon blurred into a dusky haze. This was Mars's quietest time, not fully awake, not yet dreaming. The thin air shimmered faintly, carrying whispers of dust high into the atmosphere, where sunlight turned it into golden mist. The planet seemed to hum in stillness, content in its solitude. In some regions, frost formed delicate lacework on rocks each dawn, only to vanish by midday. These fleeting patterns were the planet's breath made visible, a small gesture of endurance. Light would melt them, and shadows would call them back again, a perpetual rhythm of change that gave even the most barren places a sense of pulse. Mars thrived on these contrasts, surviving not in abundance but in balance. The volcanoes, now long asleep, still played with light and shadow. Their slopes caught the dawn before the valleys did, their rims glowing like embers. As the sun rose higher, those glowing peaks faded into rust-colored stone, leaving behind long, dark silhouettes that reached across the plains. These ancient giants reminded the planet of what it once was, a world that had known heat, eruption, and brilliance. Craters, too, told stories through their shadows. Some were deep enough that sunlight never fully touched their floors. In those permanent pockets of night, frost and ice found refuge. The contrast between their cold silence and the sunlit rims above was breathtaking, a reminder that survival often hides in darkness, not in brightness. Mars carried this dual truth gently, never choosing one over the other. Even the smallest stones participated in the dialogue between shadow and light. Their rough surfaces captured dust, reflected glints of sun, and cast miniature darkness across the ground. Millions of such interactions played out every second, forming an invisible web of energy exchange. The planet was not static, it was breathing through light itself, absorbing and releasing, holding and letting go. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a final golden hue stretched across the plains. It clung to the rocks, the dunes, and the distant mountains, a fleeting warmth before the plunge into cold. In that moment, Mars looked almost tender, bathed in colors that spoke of endurance. Then, as darkness took hold, the temperature dropped sharply, and the stars reclaimed the sky. The night brought clarity. Without thick air to scatter the light, stars shone with piercing brilliance, their reflections faintly visible even on the frost. Shadows deepened into pure blackness, erasing the boundaries between land and sky. Yet, in this vast quiet, something enduring stirred, the knowledge that each dawn would come again, bringing light to touch what shadow had preserved. Over time, the daily struggle between warmth and cold sculpted everything. Rocks fractured, sands migrated, and dust settled in new patterns. The surface became a living record of endurance, a planet constantly remade by the delicate warfare between energy and absence. Even erosion, the slow sculptor of eternity, moved by the command of the sun and its loyal companion, shadow. Sometimes, thin clouds of ice crystals would drift through the sky, scattering sunlight into halos. These moments of soft radiance offered reprieve from the planet's starkness. The light became gentle then, muted by reflection and mist, touching the surface like a memory of rain. In those moments, Mars seemed almost kind, its harshness softened by the brief kindness of diffusion. Canyons, especially the Great Valles Marineris, told another story. Within their depths, light arrived late and left early. Shadows pooled there, eternal and cool. Yet when sunlight finally reached in, it painted the walls in bands of gold and crimson, revealing layers of ancient stone and history. The interplay of light within those walls was like music played slowly, deep, resonant, and full of silence between the notes. In regions near the equator, where sunlight lingered longest, survival took on new meaning. The soil baked, then froze, again and again. Cracks widened, minerals reformed, and the land adapted. Even in the harshest zones, Mars found ways to endure, reshaping itself through cycles of light's cruelty and shadow's comfort. Each sunrise brought renewal, not of life, but of rhythm. Shadows retreated reluctantly, allowing the ground to glow once more. Dust sparkled as it lifted, carried by faint breezes. From orbit, these transitions appeared almost alive, a planet that shimmered and pulsed, though no heartbeat within. Mars's strength was not in motion, but in its graceful stillness under relentless light. Even now, remnants of that slow battle remain in every photograph sent from its surface. Light and darkness carved the same shapes each day, yet each time slightly different, slightly shifted. The planet's surface records these shifts like pages of a diary no one else can write. It survives not because it resists, but because it yields, allowing both radiance and shadow to define it equally. The balance between the two became Mars's quiet art form. Its mountains cast poetry across valleys, its dunes whispered the language of impermanence. Each day's light sculpted the face of the planet anew, and each night's shadow preserved its secrets. This interplay was the heart of its endurance, a constant dialogue between what was revealed and what was hidden. Even in this fragile dance, chemistry continued its patient work. Light drove reactions, shadow allowed rest. Together, they formed the planet's heartbeat. Without the cruelty of daylight, the minerals would never change. Without the mercy of night, they would crumble. Mars had learned to live within its contradictions, finding beauty in balance rather than abundance. As centuries turned to millennia, the sun itself changed slightly, growing brighter with age. Mars adapted in silence, adjusting its skin of dust, its reflective ice, its temperature shifts. Each adaptation was a small act of resilience, an unspoken vow to remain under the same sky, no matter how it burned or dimmed. The shadows, once merely the absence of light, became something more, protectors of memory. They preserved frost, chemistry, and time. Within them, echoes of ancient warmth lingered, hidden from decay. Light revealed Mars to the eye, but shadow revealed it to the soul. Together, they made the red planet whole. And so, under the eternal gaze of the sun, Mars continued its quiet ritual. Day followed night, light followed darkness, and the cycle went on, indifferent and yet full of grace. Shadows lengthened and faded, light returned and receded, and the planet endured it all, patient, scarred, and luminous. Perhaps that was Mars's greatest secret. It did not fight its harsh days, it learned from them. In every sunrise and every long dusk, it found a way to survive through harmony, not defiance. It let the light carve its face, let the shadows soothe its wounds. And so, across eons of brilliance and frost, the planet kept living not in fire or water, but in the quiet companionship of shadows and light. Beneath the dim glow of a sun that never felt too close, Mars began to hum quietly with the faintest signs of persistence. In the shallow soils and the hidden warmth below rocky crusts, life whispered its endurance. Tiny colonies of microorganisms gathered like invisible tapestries, forming delicate communities that breathed together, sharing the limited energy that filtered through minerals and faint sunlight. It was not a loud creation, but a patient one, life not in haste, but in harmony. Each grain of dust around them carried stories of chemical exchanges. Water still lingered in frost or trickles beneath the surface, feeding small networks of microbial growth that clung to iron and sulfur, weaving bonds of survival in silence. These microbes didn't compete fiercely, they existed as a family of necessity, adjusting their needs to the slow rhythm of a planet turning colder. Their colors might have once glowed faintly red or green under thin sunlight, faint reflections of unseen energy exchanges. The air, thin as a whisper, still managed to move enough to deliver slight temperature changes. Every subtle breeze brushed across these hidden gardens, cooling them at night, warming them by day. And yet, they adapted, slowly, deliberately. Some microbes may have formed shells or cysts to guard against the harshness. Above, curling inward to protect the essence of life during the long Martian nights. They knew rest, they knew stillness, and in that stillness, they endured. Over thousands of years, these microscopic gardens built fragile ecosystems. Layers of thin biofilms clung to rocks like forgotten paint, etched in patterns only time could understand. When water receded, some went dormant, others adapted to draw moisture from minerals. In darkness, they found quiet company, forming chains of existence across fractures in stone, whispering nutrients from one cell to another in ghostly coordination. They didn't need eyes to see or mouths to speak, their language was chemistry. Hydrogen passed like a secret. Carbon dioxide transformed gently into sustenance. Energy came not from abundance but from the smallest gifts, light filtered through dust, heat stored from the planet's core. To live was not a struggle, but an act of patience, a partnership with stillness. Through this unseen cooperation, Mars began to nurture its own hidden world. The microbes shaped their surroundings, subtly altering minerals, releasing gases, breathing their tiny imprints into the planet's surface. What began as inert rock slowly turned into reactive soil, dust-kissed by biology. The line between living and lifeless began to blur beneath the red haze. Each dawn carried quiet survival stories. As the frost melted, droplets seeped into tiny crevices where these microbial communities waited, absorbing and converting, exhaling soft traces of life into the thin Martian air. They existed in a fragile equilibrium, too much sun could dry them to dormancy, too little heat could freeze them in place. Yet, They persisted, finding life between extremes. Sometimes, storms would roll across the plains, carrying with them grains of life. Dust storms became vessels of migration. Microscopic travelers clung to airborne sand, moving across craters and ridges to find new homes. In this wandering, Mars became alive with hidden motion, a quiet pilgrimage of cells across deserts of stone. As millions of years passed, these gardens shaped subtle fingerprints across the planet. Their presence left mineral patterns unlike any purely chemical process. Rocks bore thin films of oxidized traces, silent signatures of ancient respiration. Deep below, where warmth met frozen layers, the activity remained steady, quiet yet deliberate. There was a tenderness in their endurance, as though life had chosen to survive softly rather than loudly. Mars became a planet that breathed in whispers, hosting a life that was content in obscurity. The microbes asked for nothing but the chance to continue, to rest and awaken in rhythm with the planet's subtle pulses. Theirs was a story of balance. No predator, no prey, only quiet sharing of energy, an ancient pact to keep existing. The Martian soil became their blanket, the frozen water their sustenance, the slow light their reminder of time's passing. In every pause between seasons, they gathered strength to begin again. And sometimes, when the thin air shimmered at dawn, faint gases might have risen, methane, hydrogen, oxygen, all breathing together like invisible sighs. For any observer, those signs might have looked like chance chemistry, but to the planet, it was song, a soft hymn of life barely seen. This was Mars not as a barren sphere, but as a quiet sanctuary. The microbes were caretakers, unseen and uncelebrated, weaving resilience into the planet's fabric. They lived in the cracks of cliffs, under the crust, inside the warmth of mineral veins, everywhere patience could hold on to existence. Even as the planet cooled and lost more of its atmosphere, some adapted deeper underground. They followed the warmth, seeking protection from the cosmic chill. Their existence became hidden, not gone, an underground world where silence echoed like prayer. Each droplet that formed from melting frost became a cradle of renewal. Within it, dormant cells reawakened, stretching, dividing, and sending new lines of life through tiny pores. It was as if the planet itself exhaled life when the sun rose high enough to touch its surface. Though unseen, their influence spread. Mars's surface minerals began to change color over eons, subtly shifted by biochemical reactions. Iron oxide deepened into shades of red, orange, and brown, a living palette painted by invisible hands. There was beauty in their restraint. They thrived without overwhelming, lived without consuming. Each community understood its role within the vast stillness, maintaining balance between energy gained and energy spent. Their existence felt almost meditative, life as awareness, life as stillness. And as Mars's air thinned further, they adapted again. Some sealed themselves away entirely, entering a timeless sleep, waiting for conditions to return. Others clung to moisture in salt deposits, enduring where liquid water was rare. Each strategy reflected a soft intelligence, a knowing that life's rhythm need not rush. Beneath all that quiet, the planet carried memory of cells that lived in patience, of molecules rearranged by intention rather than chaos. If one could listen deeply enough, the red dust might hum with their ancient breath, a lullaby of endurance sung through mineral and time. They were not gone, only resting, sleeping guardians of a world once warmer, still holding the code of life within their microscopic forms. In every grain of dust lay possibility, in every stone, a trace of survival. Mars remained alive in spirit, pulsing softly beneath its scarlet skin. The silence around them was not emptiness, it was protection, space for life to grow unseen. In this vast stillness, these microbial gardens continued their watch, unchanged yet eternal, the quiet heart of a planet learning to endure. And though no eyes could witness their beauty, their existence was enough. For in the quiet corners of Mars, where warmth lingered faintly and shadows stretched long, life had found its purpose, to be, gently and endlessly. The planet had begun to sigh, its once faintly warm breath cooling into stillness. The molten heart that once pulsed beneath Mars's crust slowed its rhythm, and the quiet warmth that had fed springs and softened the land began to fade. The air grew thinner, stretched too far to hold its heat. The red world, once touched by mild rivers and shallow seas, now felt the first whisper of retreat, a soft surrender to the inevitable chill. Life that had bloomed in hidden pockets began to feel the pull of silence returning. At first, the change came softly, unnoticed by the smallest beings who depended on warmth. The cycles of frost and thaw grew longer, the moments of liquid water shorter. Each dawn brought less comfort, each dusk a longer night. What had once been balance slowly tilted toward stillness. The planet's crust contracted under the loss of inner fire, forming scars that stretched across plains and mountains. Mars, the quiet world of possibility, was beginning to grow old. Dust became the new ruler of the air. It moved across valleys and craters, wrapping the surface in fine, shifting veils. Sunlight dimmed through this haze, losing its strength before it reached the ground. What warmth it carried scattered among particles, never fully touching the soil. The faintest rivers vanished into memory, leaving behind only the ghostly traces of their paths, channels carved by time and devotion, now dry, like words once whispered and then forgotten. The microbes that had once thrived near the surface withdrew slowly, instinctively. They descended into the deeper layers, following warmth into mineral pockets where heat lingered longer. Their communities thinned, yet their will endured. Life learned, again, how to be still. The rhythm of existence slowed, matching the planet's cooling pulse. Mars did not die suddenly, it dimmed, like a candle nearing its last flicker. Above, the sky shifted hues. The soft golden light that once scattered gently across thin air became colder, tinted with the pale grey of exhaustion. The winds carried frost, tracing the ground with intricate patterns that glimmered faintly at dawn. The beauty remained, but it was a quiet, frozen kind of beauty, the kind that holds its breath in reverence for what once was. The red planet entered its long twilight. Even in this retreat, life clung on where it could. Some microorganisms adapted to the freeze, encasing themselves in protective shells. Others retreated deep enough to find liquid beneath ice, where geothermal whispers still murmured. Beneath meters of frozen dust, microcosms of endurance continued their patient watch. They were survivors of fading warmth, the last keepers of memory. The planet's atmosphere, once capable of holding whispers of rain, thinned until it could barely cradle a cloud. Winds grew fierce and lonely, stripping away remnants of water and scattering dust across endless plains. Mars's voice became quieter, its surface more brittle. Where lakes once shimmered faintly, now only salt dust remained, pale scars left by retreating time. Each season stretched into the next without much difference. Warmth became a fleeting visitor, touching the planet briefly before disappearing into the cold expanse of space. The soil, once moist enough to nurture small ecosystems, became a crust of frozen minerals. Yet deep within, some warmth lingered still, a hidden ember, not extinguished, only covered by the long years of distance from the sun's embrace. Mars's magnetic field had already faded long ago, leaving it open to the winds of space. Without that invisible shield, the planet began to lose its precious air to the solar breath. Bit by bit, molecules escaped, drifting into the void. The sky thinned further, and the pressure fell. Mars became fragile, a world unable to hold onto its own breath. Yet it did not resist. It simply became quieter. Still, even silence has life within it. Beneath the surface, frozen. Aquifers hummed faintly with potential. Ancient salts captured moisture, releasing it when the rare warmth returned. Microbial communities slept within, their metabolism slowed to near timelessness. The fading warmth became not an end, but a lullaby reminding all who endured that rest is also a form of survival. The surface transformed into a museum of memory. Dry channels, cracked basins, and layered cliffs spoke of an earlier grace. The winds sculpted these remains gently, as though the planet itself wished to preserve them. Every ridge became an echo, every canyon a reminder of movement that once was. Mars was remembering itself in stone. The light changed too. Where once sunlight warmed the dust to soft crimson, now it cast sharper shadows. The landscape hardened under this colder glow. It was beautiful in its stillness, but fragile in its isolation. The last glimmers of warmth retreated into the planet's belly, leaving the surface to the frost and wind. As the centuries passed, even the deep springs began to fade. Pressure lessened, and what little liquid remained froze solid, expanding into veins of ice through the rocks. The gentle breath of geothermal heat weakened, silencing one refuge after another. Yet the planet did not despair, it simply adapted to stillness. Its rhythms slowed, its heart beat deeper. Somewhere far below, the oldest microbes may have formed networks of dormancy, awaiting conditions that might never return. They carried, in microscopic patience, the ancient signature of life. Their chemistry, once vibrant, slowed to nearly nothing, but not nothing. Like embers in deep ash, they glowed softly with potential, waiting across millennia. Above, storms still wandered the plains, but they no longer brought change. They were echoes of the planet's former pulse, carrying dust from one memory to another. From crater to canyon, they moved endlessly, whispering over rocks that had seen both life and loss. The sound of the wind became the planet's only heartbeat. Even as Mars cooled, it retained beauty. The vast polar caps gleamed with frozen carbon dioxide, reflecting sunlight in silent brilliance. The contrast between the red dust and white frost painted a haunting calmness across the world. It was not a dead world, it was a dreaming one, suspended in a long, cold meditation. The sun, distant and small, still traced its light across the horizon each day. Shadows lengthened, stretched thin over the ground, as if reluctant to leave. In those shadows lay the memory of warmth, the ghost of old rivers, the outline of vanished shores. Mars remembered not through sound, but through form. Every now and then, impacts would awaken the surface, a meteor, a tremor, a sudden release of buried ice. For brief moments, warmth returned, fleeting but real. Gases hissed into the thin air, and for a heartbeat, Mars felt alive again. But like breath in winter, it vanished quickly, leaving silence once more. The retreat of warmth did not come as tragedy, it was a slow exhale, a cosmic acceptance. Life had touched Mars and then withdrawn, leaving behind the delicate traces of its passage. The planet had done what it could, it had hosted, nurtured, and then, when the time came, it let go gently. Over millions of years, the frost deepened, the rocks cracked, and the color of the dust changed subtly. Yet beneath it all, Mars held its secret. The faint warmth that remained beneath the surface was enough to keep the idea of life alive, not in form, but in memory. Even in fading, the planet glowed softly in its solitude. It circled the sun with patient grace, wearing its history as a garment of dust and ice. What had once been rivers were now gentle scars. What had once been light-filled valleys were now the quietest places in the solar system. And yet, in that stillness, there was peace. The warmth that had retreated did not abandon, it transformed into potential, waiting silently for the next touch of renewal. Mars slept, but it did not forget how to awaken. The stars above watched it turn, slow and dignified. Time, like frost, layered itself upon the planet, deepening its beauty. The red hue became softer, almost tender, as if the universe itself remembered the life that had once stirred beneath its surface. In the end, Mars did not lose its warmth, it shared it with time. The planet became a cradle of memory, holding within it the echoes of chemistry, breath, and stillness. The gentle retreat of habitability was not loss, but transformation, a shift from motion to memory, from fire to quiet glow. Beneath the frost, traces of warmth still lingered, small yet unyielding. They moved faintly through rock and mineral, like ghosts of sunlight trapped in stone. Each one carried the possibility that one day, when the stars aligned and the warmth returned, life might rise once again from beneath the red dust. The fading warmth became not an ending, but a promise, soft, patient, eternal. Mars continued its slow rotation beneath the stars, wrapped in silence, dreaming of rivers and mornings that once were. It was still beautiful, still alive in memory, still part of the great story of life's resilience. Even as the cold deepened, the spirit of warmth lingered, an invisible pulse in the heart of a quiet world, waiting for touch, waiting for time, waiting to breathe again. When the warmth had nearly vanished and the planet's breath grew faint, what remained of Mars's living memory began to settle into the soil. Life, once tender and unseen, left its quiet impressions in minerals and sediment. The smallest of organisms, no larger than grains of dust themselves, became eternal through the patience of stone. Their bodies, though fragile, found preservation in stillness etched into layers that time would guard for eons. The world that had nurtured them began to record their passing in silence, as fossils too small for the eye but vast in meaning. The rivers that had once carried whispers of motion now lay still, their beds thick with sediments shaped by long-gone flow. In those ancient layers, traces of carbon, sulfur, and iron mingled with remnants of life's chemistry. Over countless freeze-thaw cycles, they hardened, turning into rock, preserving ghostly patterns that spoke of biology. These were not fossils like those found on Earth, no bones, no shells, but molecular memories, chemical fingerprints left behind by cells that once swam in microscopic seas. Each grain of rock became an archive. Mars, in its stillness, began to tell a story in code, molecules arranged with intention, hints of biological rhythm preserved in oxidation states, isotopic imbalances, and mineral veins that should not have existed without life. The planet itself became a monument, not to grandeur, but to fragility, the beauty of existence that endures even after it has ceased to move. Storms carried these stones from place to place, scattering the memories across plains and into craters. The wind was a gentle archivist, uncovering one layer while burying another. Over millennia, the surface became a mosaic of time-old rock meeting younger dust, fossils meeting erosion, everything cycling quietly. The planet had become both grave and storyteller. As ice advanced, it encased many of these relics, sealing them beneath frost and sediment. There, in the cold and pressure, minerals reacted slowly with the organic traces, preserving their patterns. The dance between chemistry and silence continued, with each interaction, leaving a faint mark of what once lived. Some pockets may still hold these remains, untouched by erosion or cosmic impact, waiting in the deep stillness to be seen again. Every now and then, meteor impacts fractured the crust, exposing hidden veins of these fossilized whispers. Briefly, sunlight would touch them again, warming surfaces that had not felt heat in millions of years. Then, as the dust settled, they would return to quiet shadow, undisturbed. Mars seemed to hold its secrets deliberately, as though life's story was meant to be discovered only when the time was right. The colors of the rocks carried clues too. Hematite spheres, tiny, iron-rich nodules, hinted at watery pasts, perhaps even microbial shaping. Clay minerals, layered delicately, spoke of slow formation under wet conditions. Each hue, from crimson to ochre, was a language of transformation, written by life and preserved by time. The planet had become an artist whose brush never lifted, painting its own biography in dust and stone. In some places, underground ice sealed entire regions in permafrost, suspending ancient materials in near-perfect preservation. If one could look closely enough, perhaps tiny cell-like structures would still remain, encased in minerals, echoes not alive but not entirely gone either. The cold had become both destroyer and protector, freezing memory into permanence. Time moved differently here. Centuries passed without change. The traces remained untouched, waiting. Even as radiation from the sun stripped away the surface layers, the deeper strata guarded what mattered most. Mars's surface looked barren, but below, the planet carried a quiet abundance of history, stories locked within crystals, molecules, and veins of clay. The winds, unknowing, revealed fragments of these histories with every storm. Patterns of erosion uncovered ridges that once bordered lakes. Layered rocks stood like pages of an ancient book, each stratum holding a chapter of Martian time. Those who would one day walk there might read these pages not through sight alone, but through chemistry, through the balance of elements that whispered, life was here. The stillness became a form of preservation. Without tectonic shifts or oceans to erase them, Mars's fossils endured longer than Earth's might. The absence of movement meant permanence. Each trace of microbial existence, each microscopic fossil, was held in suspension, spared from decay by the planet's own still heart. Deep in the craters where water once pooled, sediments thickened over time. Layer upon layer built upon each other, forming natural vaults of history. The soft organics within them turned to mineral shadows, structures that held the memory of shape if not substance. Even without life's pulse, the planet remembered the rhythm of its former inhabitants. Volcanoes, once givers of warmth, became archivists too. When lava cooled over wet ground, it trapped pockets of ancient sediment. These hardened into glass-like rocks, sealing tiny fragments of the world that had existed before. Within these glassy tombs might still rest the chemical ghosts of living cells, protected from time's erosion. As the ages passed, Mars became quieter still, but its surface continued to reveal subtle signatures. The atmosphere, thin as it was, carried dust rich with iron oxides and carbonates, each particle containing remnants of processes once guided by biological hands. Even without life's presence, its echoes shaped the air and soil. The planet's quiet became profound, a silence filled with stories. Fossils were not only remnants of bodies but of relationships between minerals and living chemistry. Every ridge, every layer, was a collaboration between biology and geology, preserved now as still art. In this way, Mars became a cathedral of memory, vast and hushed. Occasionally, the faint warmth of sunlight would reach just deep enough to awaken reactions in the frozen ground. Gases would stir, minerals would shift, and for a fleeting moment, something almost alive would move within the stillness. These chemical resurrections were echoes of what once was imitations of life's spark still dancing faintly in the dark. Each time the planet turned toward the sun, its old marks glowed softly under the faint light. Valleys once cut by water shimmered faintly with minerals that had grown in wet times. To look upon them was to witness both birth and loss at once, a beauty born from endurance, not from thriving. Mars's fossils were not mere remains, they were expressions of grace under endless time. Even in its loneliness, Mars had not lost its tenderness. It continued to carry, gently, the fossils of its brief living chapter. It did not erase them. It let them be, untouched, as if in respect. The thin winds brushed over ancient formations, tracing outlines of vanished lakes like fingers on faded pages. The planet's patience became its devotion. The idea of life remained in the soil, not in the form of cells, but in the arrangement of elements, hydrogen bound to carbon, sulfur shaped by energy, patterns of oxidation that defied mere geology. The very chemistry of Mars still hummed faintly with the rhythm of life, a melody slowed by the ages but not silenced. If one could listen closely, perhaps even now, the rocks would whisper. They would speak of warmth long gone, of rivers that sang softly, of communities that breathed without sound. They would tell of the gentle fall into coldness, and of how even endings can leave beautiful marks behind. The echoes reached deep into the planet's crust. Each fault line, each crack, held fragments of time, tiny clues locked in minerals that once kissed liquid water. The fossils there were invisible but undeniable. They spoke of a truth that the universe loves to repeat, that life, however small, always leaves a trace. The longer Mars slept, the deeper its memories sank. Dust covered old channels, filling them with fine red powder, but beneath the surface, those channels still existed. Fossils rested in silence, the outlines of microbial mats still etched into stone, like fingerprints of a vanished breath. The polar regions preserved more than ice, they preserved time. Within the frozen layers, gases trapped from ancient atmospheres lay sealed, bearing witness to eras when air was thicker and life perhaps still stirring. In those bubbles, chemistry slumbered, waiting to be read by minds yet unborn. Every impact that disturbed the surface added to the record, not erased it. The scattered stones became carriers of history, spreading fragments of ancient Mars across its plains. Some even found their way to space, ejected by collisions, drifting through the void, messengers carrying Mars's memories beyond its skies. The passage of time only made the traces more sacred. The erosion softened their shapes but deepened their story. Like the fading ink of an ancient manuscript, the fossils whispered louder in their quietness. They were no longer remnants, they were relics of persistence. To stand upon Mars now, one would not see life but would feel it, hidden in the geometry of rock, in the layering of clay, in the patient order of mineral veins. The planet still breathed in its own way, exhaling dust and inhaling time. Within that cycle, the traces endured. Even as the world around them grew colder, the fossils remained untouched. They were the pulse beneath the frost, the quiet affirmation that once, warmth had danced here, and chemistry had learned to care for itself. The stones remembered when no one else could. In the endless night, Mars glowed faintly under the touch of starlight. Each rock, each ridge, was part of a vast elegy, a song composed by the meeting of time, silence, and memory. Fossils and echoes in stone became the only language left, and it spoke with beauty deeper than sound. And so, Mars continued to turn, slowly, steadily, lovingly, carrying its traces through the centuries. It did not mourn the loss of its warmth or its living breath, it simply remembered. In every scar, every fossil, every whisper of chemistry beneath the dust, the planet held on to its soft truth: life, once given, never truly leaves.